Ryder has finally started to put his notes into manuscript form.
This morning I walked to the place where the street cleaners dumped the rubbish. My God, it was beautiful.
Says a Van Gogh letter.
Orchestra play like pig.
Being an Arturo Toscanini explanation of why he would not apologize to his Metropolitan Opera musicians after cursing at them in Italian.
Ryder had been scribbling the notes on 3x5 index cards. They now come close to filling 2 shoebox tops taped together end to end.
A seascape by Henri Matisse was once hung upside down in the Museum of Modern Art in New York.
And left that way for a month and a half.
Church bells were already ringing to announce the armistice in November 1918 when word reached Wilfred Owen's family that he had been killed in battle 1 week before.
Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ascalon.
Actually, Ryder could have begun to type some weeks ago. For whatever reason, he's been procrastinating.
What a man does is all that counts, not what he intends to do,
said Picasso.
From high up on the Sistine ceiling scaffolding, Michelangelo was known to now and then drop things. Brooms, even fairly long boards.
Most frequently, it appeared, when the Pope happened to be lurking below for a glimpse at his latest efforts.
Nietzsche died after a sequence of strokes, but his final illness and his madness were almost surely the result of syphilis.
William Blake lived and dressed in inconceivable filth and virtually never bathed.
Mr. Blake's skin don't dirt, his wife Catherine contributed.
Picasso made Gertrude Stein sit more than 80 times for her portrait.
And then painted out the head and redid it 3 months later without having seen her again.
Leonardo da Vinci's father had 4 wives.
None of whom was Leonardo's mother.
Karl Marx never in his life saw the inside of a factory.
F. Scott Fitzgerald was an anti-Semite.
The second Brandenburg Concerto on an indestructible phonograph disc is drifting eternally in space, affixed to Voyager 2.
Names of the dead.
One reason for Ryder's procrastination is that he seems not to have had much energy lately, to tell the truth, for work or for much of anything else.
116,000 viewers had strolled past Le Bateau, the upside-down Matisse, without comment, or it was rehung correctly.
Not until a year after his burial at Sag Harbor did someone notice that the title of the recognitions was misspelled on the back of William Gaddis's headstone.
In 1579, when Shakespeare was 15, the population of Stratford would have been little more than 1,500. Is it a safe assumption that he knew the woman named Catherine Hamlet, who fell into the Avon that summer and drowned?
An eccentric, dreamy, half-educated recluse in an out-of-the-way New England village cannot with impunity set at defiance the laws of gravitation and grammar. Oblivion lurks in the immediate neighborhood,
said Thomas Bailey Aldrich of Emily Dickinson.
Gray's elegy is 128 lines long. Gray spent 7 years writing it.
The world is my idea.
Van Gogh, in a letter from Arles, some few weeks after having presented a piece of his ear to a woman in a brothel.
I went yesterday to see the girl I had gone to when I went astray in my wits. They told me that in this country, things like that are not out of the ordinary.
Mithridates, who his houseman says took poison in small doses to build an immunity.
And was run through by a sword.
If an ox can paint a picture, his god would look like an ox,
said Xenophanes.
Then again, Ryder doesn't feel like he's lost much time by not typing, since he's done a good deal of shuffling and rearranging of the index cards. Ryder is pretty sure that most of them are basically in the sequence he wants.
Levi Strauss.
The invention of melody is the supreme mystery of man.
Claude Monet's admission, after standing beside the deathbed of someone he had loved, that in spite of his grief, he had spent much of the time analyzing which pigments comprised the color of her eyelids.
Bertrand Russell was so inept physically that he could never learn to make a pot of tea.
Immanuel Kant could not manage to sharpen a quill pen with a penknife.
John Stuart Mill could barely tie a simple knot.
Tartini's violin,
which shattered in its case at his death.
The greatest genius of our century, Goethe called Byron.
The greatest genius of our century, Byron called Goethe.
Not that rearranging his notes means that the writer has any real idea where the work is headed, on the other hand. Ideally, in fact, it will wind up someplace that will surprise even Ryder himself.
That day being come, Caesar going into the Senate house and speaking merrily unto the soothsayer told him, The Ides of March be come.
So be they, softly answered the soothsayer, but they are not yet past.
Giotto's portrait of Dante, a reproduction of which tilts on a shelf beside Ryder's desk, was probably painted after Dante died. Nonetheless, it's the only one by someone who knew him. The two small rough stones beside the Dante portrait are from Masada, once brought to Ryder as a souvenir by his daughter.
One of the ennobling delights of paradise, as promised by Thomas Aquinas.
Viewing the condemned as they are tortured and boiled below.
Little more than a device for getting revenge upon those who are having a better time on earth.
Mencken called the Christian concept of immortality.
Leonardo's notebooks indicate that he knew the sun did not move before Copernicus did.
The friendship of Samuel Beckett and Alberto Giacometti.
The devil damn thee black, thou cream-faced loon. Where gottest thou that goose look?
Wrote Shakespeare in Macbeth.
Now, friend, what means thy change of countenance?
Substituted William Davant, a rewritten version that was played for almost a century.
The last words of Mr. Despondency were, Farewell night, welcome day. His daughter went through the river singing, but no one could understand what she said.
I was tired and ill. I stood looking across the fjord. The sun was setting. The clouds were colored red, like blood. I felt as though a scream went through nature.
Said Edvard Munch.
Can only have been painted by a madman.
Said Munch of the same canvas.
Constable's habit of frequently making detailed notes on the reverse of his sketches for landscapes. Place, date, time, weather, and once.
Lovely. So much that I could not paint for looking.
Leigh Hunt once saw Charles Lamb kiss Chapman's Homer.
Henry Crabb Robinson once saw Coleridge kiss a Spinoza.
Lamb was in fact known to pretend surprise that people did not say grace before reading.
Thou sayest it.
Before Sylvia Plath turned on her oven to commit suicide, she left bread and butter and milk in the bedroom where her 2 children were sleeping.
One of Edvard Munch's sisters went mad.
Ryder's pretty much tempted to quit writing.
Leonardo, explaining to the Duke of Milan how it occurred that he might sit in front of the Last Supper for hours and not add a single brushstroke.
Men of genius often are doing most when they work least.
It takes a lot of time to be a genius. You have to sit around so much doing nothing, really doing nothing.
Said Gertrude Stein.
It is not amusing, it is not interesting, it is not good for one's mind.
Said T.S. Eliot regarding Stein's prose.
Ryder's weary unto death of making up stories.
I am quite content to go down to posterity as a scissors and paste man.
Said Joyce.
A work with no intimation of story whatsoever, Ryder would like to contrive, plotless, characterless.
Too lazy to copy down passages he thought he might later wish to quote. De Quincey often simply ripped them out of the book at hand.
Even when the book was someone else's.
An unmanly sort of man whose love life seems to have been largely confined to crying in laps and playing house.
Auden called Poe.
Men have died from time to time, and worms have eaten them, but not for love.
Actionless, Ryder wants it, which is to say, with no sequence of events.
There is no mention of writing in the Iliad. Any and all messages are passed along verbally.
Which is to say, with no indicated passage of time.
There is no work of art without a subject, said Ortega.
A novel tells a story, said E.M. Forster.
Then again, getting somewhere in spite of all this.
Tell all the truth, but tell it slant.
I love fool's experiments. I am always making them.
Said Darwin.
All life is an experiment,
said Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr.
The measure of a man's greatness would be in terms of what his work cost him.
Wittgenstein once told someone.
From a letter of Balzac's in his mid-30s, recording that in a fit of creative frenzy, he had just spent 26 consecutive days without once leaving his study.
Sometimes it seems to me that my very brain is on fire.
Delmore Schwartz, in his disturbed final years, hearing voices and insisting that they were directed at him from the spire of the Empire State Building.
Space is blue, and birds fly through it.
Said Werner Heisenberg.
God does not inhabit healthy bodies.
Said Saint Hildegard of Bingen.
No one ever painted a woman's backside better than Boucher, said Renoir.
At 18, John Stuart Mill spent several nights in jail for having distributed birth control pamphlets in a London slum.
That blockhead John Stuart Mill. Nietzsche anointed him.
Without exception, the best and least selfish man I ever knew, said Byron after Shelley's death.
Presumably not remembering that Shelley had deserted Harriet, 19 and 4 months pregnant, to run off with Mary, also pregnant.
And leaving Harriet to drown herself less than 2 years later.
For whatever reason, Jean Sibelius did not write a note in the last 30 years of his life.
People speak of naturalism in opposition to modern painting. Where and when has anyone ever seen a natural work of art?
Ask Picasso.
Nonlinear, discontinuous, collage-like, an assemblage, as is already more than self-evident.
How miraculous it was, noted Diogenes, that whenever one felt that sort of urge, one could readily masturbate.
But conversely, how disheartening that one could not simply rub one's stomach when hungry.
Hatred of the bourgeois is the beginning of all virtue, said Flaubert.
A work of intellectual reference and allusion, and in which the writer will say more about himself only when he finds no way to evade doing so, but rarely otherwise.
The reason for your complaint lies, it seems to me, in the constraint your intellect imposes on your imagination,
said Schiller to a friend who had difficulty writing.
Under threat of arrest in the Reign of Terror, Chamfort shot himself in the head and cut his throat.
And died of pneumonia while recovering.
Martin Heidegger was an anti-Semite.
As a sort of mantra, Kant would sometimes recite a list of people who had lived long lives, hoping to match them.
He reached 80.
My mind and fingers have worked like the damned. Homer, the Bible, Plato, Locke, Lamartine, Chateaubriand, Beethoven, Bach, Hummel, Mozart, Weber are all around me. I study them and devour them with fury.
Wrote Liszt at 20.
René Descartes was born in a hayfield.
Raymond Chandler lived with his mother until her death when he was 35, and then almost immediately married a woman 17 years older than he was.
Norman Mailer's sixth wife was the same age as his oldest daughter.
I am he that aches with amorous love,
wrote Whitman.
Walter, leave off,
wrote D.H. Lawrence.
Sappho was small and dark,
though made blonde and fleshy by Raphael in his Parnassus at the Vatican.
This man will never accomplish anything,
said Pope Leo X of Leonardo da Vinci.
This boy will come to nothing,
said Freud's father.
Rossini on the Symphonie Fantastique.
What a good thing it isn't music.
That scoundrel Brahms. What a giftless bastard.
Tchaikovsky's diary says,
men who do not devote their lives to pursuing wisdom will be reborn as women.
Determined Plato.
People who marry young will have female children.
Determined Aristotle.
Walter Scott frequently manufactured chapter epigraphs out of whole cloth, saying what he wished said, and then wrote in either old play or anon, as the alleged source.
The universe was created on October 26, 4004 BC at 9 a.m.
Announced Archbishop Usher in 1645.
Thank you very much. It was a calm night on the eve of a storm. Clouds, they rolling in. Feelings, they are street corner on an empty street. Lone street lights shining down. Cut like knives through clouds. Fog rolling like wisp of light. Lone silhouette. Bird had hiding eyes. Chin hangs down. Cigarette in the burn. Smoke joins the clouds. She becomes to fight. What was timid before shifts. Body becomes strong, determined. She moves. The clouds part like Moses in her way. Look, the sky reveals fierce eyes. Door opens before him. Staircase beckons. He'd been waiting on me, you see. This guy cluttered off with stale smoke, whiskey in his dream. She had problems, you see. He was a man that could solve those things. She sounded so broken on the phone. Oh, yeah. Come on, he said. I can't. Come when you can. And the call came in moments before from a payphone down the block. She knocked forcefully on the door. He did not move. Come on in, he said. She entered ginger, sauntering with long legs, red dress, and eyes as blue. Lightning crack flashed through the grated window behind his desk, casting brief shadow on his desk. Vision of beauty illuminated before him.
In his mid-30s, T.S. Eliot was known to wear pale green face powder. One of the Sitwells said it was to make him look as if he were suffering.
So preoccupied was Thomas Hobbes with geometry that he sometimes diagrammed propositions on his bedsheets.
Or inked them on his thigh.
Flaubert's lamp burned with such regularity late at night in his workroom at Croisset that pilots on the Seine were able to take their bearings from it.
Back to the things themselves.
Juna Barnes wrote in bed, wearing makeup and with her hair done.
Edith Wharton wrote in bed, scattering pages on the floor for a secretary to retrieve before typing.
Working as a